The morning after the kiss on the balcony, Northreach felt different. The salt air seemed crisper. The chaotic morning bells of the harbor sounded more like music than noise. And for the first time in his 27 years, Lucas woke up without the urge to check his boots for a quick exit. He found the others in the inn's common room. Broma was engaged in a heated game of dice with a local sailor. Lyra was methodically sharpening her bowstring, and Seraphine, who looked even more radiant in the morning light, was busy trying to explain to a very confused innkeeper why a goose was currently sitting in a chair, wearing a stolen silk scarf, and eating a croissant with what could only be described as refined disdain. "It's not stealing if you consider it a tax on your hospitality," Seraphine was saying with a wink. Lucas walked over, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the hearth. Seraphine's eyes lit up when she saw him, and she leaned into him as he passed, her hand brushing his arm with a familiarity that made his heart stutter. "Morning wanderer," she teased, "sleep well." "Better than I have in a decade," he admitted, pulling up a chair. Before anyone could reply, the inn door swung open with a bang. A frantic-looking man in a velvet doublet, a local magistrate, by the look of his seal, stumbled into the room. He scanned the crowded tavern, his gaze passing over the brawling sailors and the weary merchants, until it landed squarely on their table, specifically on the Goose. "You," the man gasped, pointing a shaking finger. "You are the ones, aren't you?" Broma didn't even look up from her dice. "Depends on who's asking. If you're here about the fish from the market, we've already eaten it." No, the magistrate panted, rushing over. He bypassed the human, the elf, and the dwarf and knelt before the Goose. "I am from the house of Valerius. My great-uncle Archibald passed away 3 days ago. He was eccentric, a scholar of the old ways." The Goose tilted its head, letting out a soft, judgmental honk. "Exactly," the magistrate cried, his eyes wide. "He left a will, a very specific, very binding will. He left his entire estate, the seaside manor, the library, and the vineyard to the rightful guardian of the Northreach skis." The tavern went dead silent. Even the dice players stopped. And the magistrate continued, trembling. "After consulting the village elders and the magical registries, it has been confirmed. The bird is the guardian, and by the laws of this city, the bird requires a handler." Lucas stared at the Goose. The Goose stared at the magistrate. "You're telling me," Lucas said, his voice slow, "that we're not just traveling anymore?" "You're being recruited," Lyra corrected, a small, amused smile finally breaking through her stoic mask. "Or perhaps annexed." Seraphine rested her chin on her hand, her tail flicking with pure, unadulterated delight. "Well, Lucas, it seems your career has taken a turn. You're no longer just a traveler, darling." "What am I then?" Lucas asked, feeling a strange mix of dread and excitement. Seraphine leaned in, her voice a low, melodic whisper. "You're the personal assistant to a wealthy waterfowl, and I think we're all going to be living in a mansion." The Goose stood up on the chair, flapped its wings once, and let out a sound that was less of a honk and more of a command. Broma stood up, swept all the coins off the table into her pouch, and grinned at Lucas. "Pack your bags, lad. We've got an estate to run, and if I know anything about estates, they usually have better ale than this." Lucas looked at the Goose, then at the 3 women who had somehow become his entire world. He sighed, but the smile on his face was genuine. "So," Lucas said, reaching out to take Seraphine's hand, "are we going to be lords of the manor, or are we going to be the reason that manor is burned to the ground by next week?" "Yes," they all replied in unison. The Goose honked in agreement, and for the first time in his life, Lucas didn't worry about where he was going. He just followed his chaos. The manor turned out to be less of a house and more of a crumbling Gothic fortress perched on a cliffside that looked like it had been designed by an architect who deeply misunderstood the concept of structural integrity. It was magnificent. As they approached the iron gates, the magistrate clutched his briefcase to his chest. Uncle Archibald was a man of many curiosities. He kept many things, artifacts, ancient texts, and according to the inventory, a very large collection of enchanted weather vanes. "Does it come with a kitchen?" Lucas asked, already imagining a massive hearth where he could finally cook for more than 4 people without the fear of a goose-induced accident. "It comes with a library that spans 3 floors, Lyra said, her eyes tracing the ancient stonework. "And if the ley lines are correct, a small, stable tier in the fabric of reality in the basement." Broma swung her axe onto her shoulder. "I like basements. They're usually where the best kegs are kept." Seraphine simply looked at the grand oak doors and then at Lucas. "I think this is the part where we're supposed to feel intimidated. Are we feeling intimidated?" Lucas looked at the goose, which was currently waddling up the stone steps with the regal air of a king returning from exile. "I'm just hoping the rightful guardian is willing to share the master bedroom." The interior was a chaotic masterpiece of velvet drapes, stacks of dusty books, and enough curiosities to fill a city museum. But the true test of their new lives came an hour later, in the grand dining hall. "Right," Broma said, staring at a massive, ornate table that could seat 50. "Who's going to tell the staff?" "Staff?" Lucas raised an eyebrow. "There's a butler," the magistrate said, hovering near the door. "He has been waiting for the new heir for quite some time. He is a construct, a sentient suit of armor actually. He's very particular about the tea." Before Lucas could ask what happened to the armor if the tea was cold, a clanking sound echoed through the hallway. A suit of full-plate armor, perfectly polished and carrying a silver tray, marched into the room. It stopped in front of the goose, bowed with surprising grace, and placed a bowl of golden grain and a crystal goblet of water on the floor. It then turned to Lucas. "The master of the house has requested a breakfast of venison and wild mushrooms. He expects it to be ready in 20 minutes. If it is not, I shall be forced to organize the library by existential dread instead of alphabetical order." The armor turned and marched away with a clatter. Lucas blinked. Did that bucket of bolts just threaten me? "He did," Seraphine said, walking over to wrap her arms around his waist from behind. She rested her chin on his shoulder. "And he smells like tea and floor wax. I think I love him." "We have to cook for a goose that thinks it's a lord," Lyra noted, peeking into the pantry. "And a homicidal suit of armor." "It's not just a goose," Broma said, clapping a hand on Lucas's back. "It's our ticket to never sleeping on the cold ground again. Now stop worrying about the menu, lad. The bird likes berries, you like cooking, and I like not being homeless. We've got this." Lucas looked at the table, then at his 3 companions. He felt that familiar, dangerous, wonderful spark of belonging. He walked over to the pantry, grabbed an apron that was hanging on a hook, and tied it with a grin. 20 minutes, Lucas asked. "I can do venison and mushrooms in 15. "That's my man," Seraphine cheered, already starting to raid the spice cabinets. As Lucas chopped herbs and the air began to fill with the savory scent of roasting meat, he realized something. The goose was standing on the counter, watching him with an intensity that felt almost approving. "You know," Lucas whispered to the bird as he plated the meal, "if you keep acting like a landlord, I'm going to start charging you rent." The goose let out a gentle, low-pitched honk and nudged his hand with its beak. For the first time, it didn't feel like an attack. It felt like a handshake. Outside, the storm began to howl against the cliffside. But inside, the fire was roaring, the armor was clanking in the kitchen. And for the first time in his life, Lucas Ravens knew exactly where he was going to be for dinner. "So," Seraphine called out, sliding a bowl of wine toward him, "are we going to talk about the basement, or are we just going to pretend the floor isn't humming?" "We'll talk about the basement," Lucas said, clinking his glass against hers, "after the goose finishes its venison." A week into their residency at the Cliffside Manor, the house had begun to reveal its true personality. It was, quite frankly, a bipolar piece of architecture. In the East Wing, the sunlight smelled like freshly baked bread and nostalgia. In the West Wing, the mirrors occasionally refused to reflect anything but the previous century. Lucas stood in the kitchen, carefully searing a loin of boar he'd managed to barter from a local hunter for a crate of the manor's strangely glowing wine. He was becoming an expert at cooking with magical flora. If he used shadowroot, the gravy turned a vibrant shade of violet, but it tasted like a warm hug. If he added star petal, the food literally floated a few inches off the plate. He was currently aiming for non-levitating lunch. "The butler is organizing the poetry section," Lyra said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked exhausted, her elegant traveling leathers replaced by a simple tunic. "He's currently trying to categorize the works of the bards of Oakhaven under heartbreak induced by inadequate footwear. I think he's finally snapped." Lucas chuckled, flipping the boar with a flourish. "Tell him if he finishes by dinner, I'll bake him a commemorative grace cake. He seems to respond well to rewards." "He's a suit of armor, Lucas. He doesn't eat," Lyra reminded him, though she didn't leave. She watched him work with a soft, analytical gaze. "You've adjusted to this rather quickly. Most people would be terrified of a house that rearranges its corridors when you aren't looking." "I spent 3 years getting lost in forests and accidentally setting soup on fire," Lucas said, plating the meat. "Compared to that, a house that plays hide-and-seek is practically luxury living." He looked up, catching her eye. "You don't mind it, the instability?" Lyra hesitated, then stepped into the kitchen. "I've spent 200 years living in the rigid, perfect silence of the Alarwin spires. The chaos, it's exhausting. But it's also the first time in 200 years I haven't been bored." She reached out, touching the edge of the counter, then quickly pulled her hand back as if surprised by her own vulnerability. "We should check the basement, Lucas. The hum is getting louder. It's starting to vibrate the silverware." "Right, the basement." Lucas wiped his hands on his apron and untied it. "Let's find Seraphine and Broma. I don't want to go down there with just a ladle." They found Broma in the library, currently embroiled in a debate with the butler whose name was apparently Clank, about the proper classification of a tactical field guide. "I'm telling you, you shiny tin can, it belongs under weapons of mass destruction, not light afternoon reading," Broma roared, waving a leather-bound manual. "It contains a chapter on the emotional significance of the axe," Clank replied with a voice like grinding gears. "It is clearly a memoir." "It's an instruction manual on how to sunder shields." "And a beautiful journey of the soul," Clank countered. Seraphine was nowhere to be seen, but as Lucas approached the center of the library, the goose suddenly waddled out from behind a shelf. It had a small, silver monocle taped to its beak with some kind of alchemical wax. It looked at Lucas, let out a sharp, authoritative honk, and headed toward the hidden door behind the fireplace. "I think the boss wants us to go down," Lucas said, suppressing a laugh. "Finally," Broma said, slamming the manual onto the table. "I'm bored of books. I want to see what's making the floor sing." The descent into the basement was not what they expected. Instead of damp stone and cobwebs, they found a spiral staircase made of iridescent glass that glowed with a faint, pulsing blue light. At the bottom, the air felt thin and smelled like static and old memories. Seraphine was already there, standing before a large, ornate circular gate in the center of the room. She was wearing a look of intense, fascinated focus, her tail twitching rhythmically. "Oh," she whispered as they approached, "you're going to want to see this." The tear in reality wasn't a hole in the wall. It was a shimmering ripple in the air, framed by ancient runes that looked like they were dancing. And through the ripple, they could see. "Is that," Lucas squinted, "is that a beach?" Through the tear, they could see a warm, golden beach under a purple sun. A giant crab, roughly the size of a carriage, was casually playing a lute for a group of very confused-looking tropical birds. "It's a dimensional anchor," Lyra whispered, her eyes wide. "Uncle Archibald wasn't just a scholar, he was a collector of realities." The goose walked right up to the ripple, stepped through the shimmering edge as if it were a beaded curtain, and stood on the golden sand. It looked back at them, honked a command, and then proceeded to peck at the giant crab's lute string. The crab stopped playing, looked at the goose, and then immediately started a new, faster tune. "So," Seraphine said, her voice full of wicked delight as she looked at Lucas, "the goose is the guardian of the multiverse, and we are its official babysitters." "I really need a stronger drink," Broma muttered, though she looked ready to charge through the ripple with her axe drawn. Lucas looked at the tear, then at the goose, then at the three women who were his companions, his heart, and his new family. He felt the hum of the portal vibrating in his very bones, a wild, uncharted destiny spreading out before them. He reached out and took Seraphine's hand. "Well," Lucas said, his grin widening, "if we're going to be interdimensional groundskeepers, we'd better make sure the kitchen stays well stocked. Does anyone know if giant crabs like venison?" The goose let out a triumphant honk. The giant crab bowed, and for the first time in history, the line between adventurer and domesticated reality defenders became completely blurred. "I'll handle the crab," Broma said, already stepping through. "You two stay here and make sure the goose doesn't start a war." As they stepped into the unknown, Lucas realized that while he had once feared being lost, he had actually just been waiting to be found by the right kind of trouble. And this was the best kind of trouble there was. The crab dimension, as Broma had immediately dubbed it, turned out to be surprisingly pleasant, provided one didn't mind the giant crustacean's obsession with avant-garde jazz. The giant crab, who introduced himself as Claudius, was quite delighted to find that Lucas had brought seasoning. "Most travelers bring swords," the crab clicked, waving a massive claw holding a lute pick. "Very few bring rosemary. You are a person of culture." Broma was currently sitting on the sand, sharing a keg of ale she dragged through the portal with the crab, while Lyra sat cross-legged, studying the way the portal's blue light interacted with the purple sky. Seraphine, however, was keeping a close eye on the goose. The goose was standing at the edge of the water, its head tilted toward the sky. Its white feathers seemed to be shimmering, casting a pearlescent glow that looked less like bird down and more like spun starlight. "Lucas," Seraphine murmured, stepping up beside him. "Look at it. It's been doing that since we crossed over." Lucas watched as the goose let out a low, melodic trill. It wasn't a honk. It sounded like a flute playing in a high wind. The goose stretched its wings, and for a split second the shadow cast on the sand behind it didn't look like a bird at all. It looked like the silhouette of a tall, winged woman. Lucas blinked, rubbing his eyes. "Did you see that?" "I did," Seraphine said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've seen a lot of things in the lower planes, but that was divine energy, proper, ancient stuff." Lucas felt a strange, protective instinct rise in his chest. "We should get it back to the manor. It looks tired." As if in response, the goose turned around and waddled back toward the portal. It stopped in front of Lucas, let out a soft, almost human-sounding sigh, and nudged his hand with its beak. This time, there was no biting, only a warmth that traveled up Lucas's arm and settled into his chest. They returned to the manor, the portal sealing behind them with a quiet thrum. The house, sensing their return, immediately adjusted the temperature of the foyer to cozy and turned on the lamps. Clank was waiting for them at the bottom of the glass stairs. "The master has had a long day," the armor clanked, bowing toward the goose. "I have prepared the sanctum in the north tower. It is time for the next phase of stabilization." "Stabilization?" Lyra asked, stepping forward. "What does that mean, Clank?" The suit of armor shifted, the metal plates rubbing together with a sound like sharpening blades. The guardian is not merely a bird, Miss Lyra. It is a celestial anchor. It has spent centuries in a form that could exist within the physical realms without shattering them. But the manor has recognized you all as the missing key. Since you arrived, the anchor has begun to remember itself. Lucas looked down at the goose. The monocle had fallen off. Its eyes, which were usually small and beady, now held a depth of ancient, golden intelligence that made Lucas feel like he was being looked at by a mountain. "Is it going to be okay?" Lucas asked, his voice unexpectedly thick with emotion. Clank turned his helmet toward Lucas. "It is becoming more of what it truly is. I suggest you sleep, Master Lucas. The manor will be quite noisy tonight. There will be adjustments." That night, sleep was impossible. The house groaned, not the creaking of old wood, but the deep structural shifting of a living thing. Down the hall in the north tower, a soft, ethereal light leaked through the cracks in the door. Lucas sat up in his bed, unable to settle. He walked to his window, looking out at the ocean. A moment later, he felt a presence behind him. Seraphine slipped into the room, wearing a loose robe, her tail curled around her ankle. She didn't say anything. She just slid into his arms. "You're worried," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "It's a bird," Lucas said, but he didn't believe it. "A very angry, very talented bird, and now it's changing." "Everything changes, Lucas," Seraphine whispered. "Look at us. 3 weeks ago, you were a lost traveler, and I was a chaos-loving mercenary. Now, we're defending the multiverse from a library and having breakfast with a crab. It's a lot to take in." "Good," she said, kissing his jawline. "Life is meant to be a lot." Somewhere down the hall, a sound echoed, not a honk, but the resonant, crystalline ringing of a bell. Lucas stood up, unable to resist the pull. "I need to check on it." Seraphine took his hand, and together they crept toward the north tower. As they approached, the door, which had been locked for decades, swung open on its own. The room was bathed in a blinding, soft light. In the center of the chamber, sitting on a pile of cushions, was no longer a goose. The feathers were gone, replaced by a radiant, translucent luminescence that swirled like clouds. The form was still crouching, tucked in on itself, but the shape was growing, stretching, and shifting. "It's beautiful," Lucas breathed. A pair of wide, feathered wings, immense and snow-white, unfurled, brushing against the ceiling. A long, slender hand reached out, brushing against the floorboards. The energy in the room was so thick it tasted like static electricity and lilies. The figure began to rise. It was tall, framed by glowing white hair that fell like a waterfall, and though its back was turned to them, the sheer presence of it made Lucas feel like he had stepped into the middle of a holy storm. The figure turned its head. Lucas gasped. The face was ethereal, sharp-featured yet soft, with eyes that glowed like the very portal they had discovered. It was definitely female, and it looked at them not with a goose's judgment, but with a terrifying, ancient kindness. She looked at Lucas, then at Seraphine, and finally she looked at her own hands. Her voice sounded like chimes in a cavern. "I have missed having fingers." She looked at Lucas, and he saw a flicker of the old goose's personality, the stubbornness, the sass hidden deep behind the divine mask. "Well," she said, her voice teasing, "are you going to stand there staring, or are you going to tell me if that boar was seasoned correctly? I've been waiting a century for a decent meal." Lucas dropped his jaw, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. "You're still you," he managed to say. The angel being stood to her full height, her wings folding behind her like a royal cloak. She took a step toward them, her movements graceful yet slightly clumsy, as if she were still learning how to use human legs. "I am the guardian," she said, her eyes twinkling, "and I am starving. Lead the way, assistant." The silence in the north tower was broken only by the soft thump of Broma and Lyra crashing through the door. I heard a bell, and I swear if Clank started throwing silverware again, Broma stopped dead. Her mouth dropped open and her axe slid from her shoulder, clattering loudly onto the floorboards. Lyra, trailing behind, went entirely still. Her bow didn't even drop. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on the towering, radiant figure standing before Lucas and Seraphine. The angel, being the entity formerly known as the Goose, glanced at the newcomers. Her wings, massive and composed of feathers that seemed to be made of starlight, shifted slightly. "Broma," the angel said, her voice resonant and smooth. "Your boots. The left one is missing the buckle. It's been bothering me for 3 weeks." Broma's face went beet red. You were looking at my boots." "I was a goose," the angel replied, looking down at her new, slender feet. "I had a lot of time to observe the shortcomings of humanity and dwarf kind, and quite frankly, elven posture." Lyra blinked, slowly lowering her bow. You're the guardian, the celestial anchor." "I am Alara," the angel said, inclining her head. She walked toward them, her movements still slightly unpracticed, as if she were learning to walk on air. She paused in front of Lucas, looking him up and down. "And I believe I owe this one a meal, a large one." Lucas, who was still trying to process that his breakfast companion now stood a head taller than him, managed a weak smile. "Alara, it's a nice name, Alara." "It is what I was called before the fall," she said, her expression flickering with a shadow of old, ancient grief. She looked toward the window, watching the moonlight on the sea. "I took the form of the goose because it was the only way to remain hidden from the void stalkers. They hunt for power, for light, for divinity. They look for queens, generals, and goddesses." She turned back to them, a wry, distinctly familiar glint appearing in her golden eyes. "They never think to check the local park for a foul-tempered, bread-stealing waterfowl. It was the perfect disguise. Nobody suspects a goose of being a strategic genius." "Strategic genius," Broma snorted, though her shock was fatting into her usual boisterous self. "You chased a butcher for 3 blocks over a sausage." "It was a very good sausage," Alara defended, her wings puffing up defensively, a habit, clearly. "And I needed the calories to maintain the celestial projection." "So," Seraphine said, stepping forward, her violet eyes assessing the angel with a mixture of awe and competitive curiosity. "You're here now, fully formed. Does this mean you're going to be helping us defend this estate, or are you just here for the cooking?" Alara laughed, a sound like a gentle breeze through wind chimes. She reached out, her glowing fingers tracing the air, and suddenly, a simple, white linen robe shimmered into existence around her, draped over her luminescent skin. "I am the guardian of the Northreach skis," she said, "but I have grown fond of this motley crew." And she looked pointedly at Lucas. "I have grown quite fond of the way this one manages the kitchen. I shall stay. But if I find out anyone has been using the existential dread shelf for anything other than actual existential dread, I will be very cross." "Clank is going to be so happy," Lyra muttered, rubbing her temples. "He's going to have a deity to organize his library." The transition was, predictably, not smooth. By the next morning, Alara was attempting to navigate the manor's corridors. She kept forgetting how large her wings were, resulting in several knocked-over vases and one very confused portrait of a former lord. Lucas found her in the kitchen at dawn. She was standing at the counter, staring intensely at a bowl of eggs. "I haven't eaten eggs in a century," she said, not turning around. "It feels hypocritical." Lucas grabbed a skillet. "Don't eat them, then. I'm making porridge with honey and those star petals you like. Or did you prefer the boar?" Alara turned. She looked less like a distant goddess in the morning light and more like a woman who had just realized she had a physical form. She walked over, leaning against the counter. Her wings were tucked tightly against her back, making her look much smaller, almost human. "The boar was excellent," she admitted. She hesitated, then leaned closer to Lucas. "Lucas, thank you for not treating me like a celestial object. The others treat me with awe. You just treat me like you treated the goose." "Because you're still the same personality," Lucas said, cracking an egg into the pan regardless. "You're still stubborn, you're still demanding, and you still have a weird obsession with people's footwear." Ilara's lips curved into a genuine soft smile. "I suppose you're right." And Lucas added, leaning in with a playful smirk, "You still owe me for all the bread I lost to you on the road." "I shall grant you a blessing," she said grandly, her eyes twinkling. "How about you just help me with the dishes?" But Ilara laughed a real, human laugh and picked up a drying cloth. "Dish duty. Very well, Master Cook. Let the records show that the guardian of the multiverse spent her first morning as a celestial entity scrubbing a skillet." As they worked side by side, Lucas realized the manor felt less like a fortress and more like a home. With an angel in the kitchen, a dwarf bickering with a butler in the library, and a Demonkin probably currently trying to convince a giant crab to move into the guest room, it was chaos. But as Ilara's wings brushed against his shoulder, warm and soft as down, Lucas knew he wasn't lost anymore. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. "So," Ilara asked, scrubbing a bowl with surprising vigor, "tell me about this festival you mentioned. I hear there's a ring toss game I need to rig." Lucas groaned. "Oh, gods help us all." The manor, it turned out, was prone to showing off. It had spent decades under the guardianship of a goose, and now that it had an actual, genuine celestial angel under its roof, the house began to renovate itself with alarming enthusiasm. Walls moved to expand the dining room, rugs replaced themselves with woven silk that smelled faintly of clouds, and the chandeliers began to chime like a choir whenever Ilara walked beneath them. "I like the drafts," Broma complained, stumbling into the breakfast room, which was now filled with floating candelabras. "Now the house is too fancy. I feel like I need to wear a tie to eat my porridge." "It's a bit much, isn't it?" Lucas said, starring as a mahogany side table drifted past him of its own accord. Ilara sat at the head of the table, looking incredibly graceful despite the fact that she was currently trying to eat a piece of toast with a pair of silver tongs because she couldn't quite stop her hand from wanting to peck at the food. "The house is trying to please me," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the magically expanded hall. "It's very eager. It's like a giant stone puppy." "A puppy that's currently organizing a guest list for a brunch with the local nobility," Seraphine noted, leaning over a piece of parchment that had just rolled itself into a scroll. "Lucas, darling, we have the mayor, the archwizard of the coast, and by the gods, the high priestess coming at noon." "Noon," Lucas looked at the clock. "It's 10:30. And we have no wine, no music, and Ilara is currently using kitchen utensils as if they're medieval torture devices," Lyra added, looking up from her book with a dry, arched eyebrow. "I shall handle the wine," Ilara said, standing up. Her wings flared instinctively, sending 3 of the floating candelabras spinning wildly before she quickly tucked them back into her robe with a look of annoyance. "I recall where Archibald kept the vintage from the sun-blessed Isles. As for the music house, play something appropriate." The manor groaned. A wall in the corner melted away to reveal a self-playing pipe organ that immediately began blasting a tune that sounded like a cross between a royal fanfare and a tavern brawl. "Perfect," Broma said, grabbing a mop. "We're going to be the talk of the town in the worst way possible." The next hour was, by any account, a disaster of epic proportions. Lucas was sweating over a hot stove, trying to prepare hors d'oeuvres that wouldn't float away, while Seraphine tried to convince the house that tapestries that scream in the middle of the night were not appropriate decor for a brunch. Meanwhile, Ilara was busy in the cellar, accidentally filling the house's water pipes with sparkling nectar instead of water. When the doorbell finally rang, it sounded like a thunderclap. "Open it," Lyra instructed Clank. The armor suit, now wearing a very dapper, moth-eaten bow tie, marched to the door. The local nobility of Northreach were a stern, unimaginative lot. They walked in expecting a dusty, eccentric estate. They did not expect to walk into a house that was literally swaying to the beat of a pipe organ, where the air tasted like honey, and the host, an angel with glowing white hair, was standing by the door holding a bottle of wine that was currently trying to crawl out of her hand. "Welcome," Alara said, her celestial dignity momentarily challenged by the fact that the wine bottle had hooked its cork into her sleeve. "Please, ignore the singing carpets. They're currently rehearsing." The mayor of Northreach, a man with a mustache that looked like a terrified caterpillar, stared at the radiant being before him. Your Grace, we heard rumors, but we thought that I was a bird," Alara asked, finally wrestling the bottle into submission. "I was on sabbatical. A goose is much less stressful than a celestial bureaucracy. Please sit. Lucas has prepared boar, and if you touch the floating candelabras, they will bite you." Lucas stepped out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, and found the entire room staring at him. He'd barely had time to brush his hair, and he was covered in flour, but the room went quiet the moment he walked in. Seraphine stepped up beside him, hooking her arm through his. She looked at the guests with a gaze that said, "If you insult his cooking, I will find out where you live." The brunch worked. Against all logic, the nobility was enchanted. The boar was divine, the wine was intoxicating, and the house, sensing the tension, began to dim the lights to a soft, golden amber. By the time they reached the dessert course, the mayor was laughing. The archwizard was trying to figure out if Alara's wings were made of actual light or just a very high-level illusion, and Broma was busy convincing the high priestess that axe throwing was a traditional religious ceremony in her homeland. Lucas found himself in the corner of the room, sharing a quiet moment with Alara. "You did well," she whispered, her wings fluttering faintly in a way that sounded like silk rustling. "I think we did well," Lucas corrected, looking at Seraphine, who was expertly charming the archwizard into not asking too many questions about the basement portal. I think this might be a home, Alara." Alara looked at the group, her family, in all their strange, broken, wonderful glory. "It is," she agreed softly. She leaned in closer, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "You know, the mayor just asked me how a dignified celestial guardian spends her free time. I almost told him about the time I stole his wife's hat. I think he would have been horrified." Lucas laughed, shaking his head. "Don't you dare." "I won't," she chuckled. "But keep that boar coming, Lucas. Being an angel is remarkably hungry work." Seraphine appeared at his side, handing him a glass of nectar and resting her head on his shoulder. "They're leaving now, but they're already planning a return visit. I think we've officially become the most dangerous socialites in Northreach." "I just wanted to be a cook," Lucas admitted, looking at the glowing, chaotic, wonderful room. "You're a cook for an angel, a demon, an elf, a dwarf, and a house that's currently playing a waltz," Seraphine said, kissing his cheek. "That's a lot better than being a tavern musician." "Definitely better than the lute," Lucas agreed. Outside, the sun set over the cliffside, and for the first time, the manor didn't feel like an inheritance or a duty. It felt like the beginning of something that would outlast the stars. They were all there together, and for the first time in his life, Lucas knew he wasn't going anywhere else. The aftermath of the brunch was, predictably, just as chaotic as the meal itself. Once the last carriage rattled away from the cliffside, the manor decided it was time for an after-party. This involved the carpets attempting to dance with the curtains and the kitchen sink deciding to serenade the pantry with an opera about the virtues of clean porcelain. "House," Alara sighed, standing in the center of the foyer with her hands on her hips, her wings flared wide to project authority. "That is quite enough. The guests are gone. We are tired. Be still." The manor groaned a low, melodic sound, and the carpets obediently flattened themselves. The singing sink gave one final, dramatic trill and fell silent. The house settled into a soft, glowing hum, like a cat purring in its sleep. "Impressive," Lyra said, leaning against the now silent wall. Most guardians spend decades learning how to communicate with the estate's core. You just told it to be quiet. Ilara brushed a stray feather-light lock of hair from her eyes. It missed having a voice around. And frankly, I think it's just happy to have someone living here who doesn't use the library to store illicit contraband. She shot a pointed look at Broma. Broma had the grace to look guilty. It was only 3 barrels of experimental dwarven fire ale. The library was the only place with climate control. Lucas walked over. Carrying a tray of chamomile tea he'd managed to brew in the short window of silence. I think the house is just excited to have people worth showing off to, but we need to talk about the basement. The room grew quiet. The crab dimension had been sealed off since the brunch, but the floorboards beneath their feet still occasionally pulsed with that rhythmic, ethereal blue light. "The portal is changing," Ilara said, her tone suddenly devoid of its usual playfulness. She sat on the bottom step of the grand staircase, her wings folding neatly behind her. The crab Claudius sent a message through the vibration. He says the barrier between our world and the Tide realms is thinning. Something else is trying to reach through. "Something that isn't a jazz-playing crab?" Seraphine asked, her tail lashing nervously. "Something that doesn't appreciate music at all," Ilara replied. "The Void Stalkers. I led them away for a century, but they've tracked the anchor. They know the manor is no longer just a birdcage." Lucas felt his stomach tighten. The domestic bliss of the past few hours suddenly felt fragile. He walked over to Ilara, sitting beside her. He didn't feel the need to be the tough hero, but he felt a fierce need to protect this house. "So we fight?" Lucas asked. Ilara looked at him, her eyes glowing with a soft, steady intensity. "We are the guardians of the Northreach skis, Lucas. If they come for the manor, they come for the peace of this world. We protect it." "With axe and bow," Broma added, drawing her weapon from her belt and testing the edge. "And magic," Lyra said, her hands already glowing with subtle, intricate runes. "And a lot of attitude," Seraphine added, her eyes flashing crimson. Ilara smiled, and it was the smile of an ancient being who had seen empires rise and fall, yet found herself strangely comforted by the ragtag group sitting around her. "I used to do this alone. I thought I had to be a stone statue or a bird to survive it. I never thought I'd have a cook to feed me, a demon to watch my back, an elf to read the warning signs, and a dwarf to cause problems that I then have to solve." "Hey," Broma protested. "It's a team effort," Lucas said, taking Ilara's hand, then Seraphine's. He looked at Lyra and Broma, who stepped in to complete the circle. "We have the manor, we have the portal, and we have each other. If something wants to come through that tier, they're going to find out that we aren't just librarians." As they sat there, the manor's lights pulsed in time with their collective heartbeat. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a fortress, a sanctuary, and a staging ground for whatever cosmic absurdity came next. "Now," Ilara said, standing up and shaking her wings, which showered the foyer in a fine mist of starlight. "Who wants to help me fortify the library? I have a feeling the next set of visitors won't be nearly as polite as the mayor." "I'll help," Lucas said, standing up, "but only if you promise to stop trying to organize my spice rack by divine radiance. It's impossible to find the salt." Ilara laughed, a sound that chased away the shadows in the corners of the room. "No promises, Wanderer, no promises." They walked toward the library, a family forged in the most ridiculous circumstances imaginable, ready to face the void with a suit of armor for a butler and a heart full of defiance. Outside, the tide crashed against the cliffs, and for the first time, the manor stood defiant and bright against the encroaching dark. The library had become something of a tactical war room, though it still smelled predominantly of old parchment, and the peculiar flowery scent of lilies Ilara trailed in her wake. Clank, the butler, was busy boarding up the windows with planks that seemed to be made of solidified moonlight, while Broma was sharpening her axe with a whetstone that shrieked every time it touched metal. You're overthinking the entry points, Alara said. Drifting through the air, she had largely abandoned walking in favor of hovering a few inches off the ground to save her wings from clipping the bookshelves. The Void Stalkers don't come through windows. They come through the gaps, the spaces between where things are and where they should be. So they're basically house guests who don't knock? Lucas asked, balancing a tray of snacks mostly because he knew everyone fought better on a full stomach. Exactly, Alara said. She reached out, placing a hand on the library's central mahogany table. The wood glowed, and suddenly the layout of the manor appeared in a floating, three-dimensional light. They'll target the portal in the basement first. They want to tear the anchor wide open. Seraphine walked over, her eyes tracing the lines of light. If they tear the anchor, what happens to us? We cease to be, Lyra answered, her voice cold and analytical. And Northreach becomes a playground for things that don't know the difference between a city and a snack. Lucas looked at his group. They were all different elf, dwarf, Demonkin, angel, and human, but they were all standing in a circle around a map of their home, ready to defend it. It was the most normal thing he had ever done, which was entirely absurd. Then we make sure the basement is a bad place to visit, Broma grunted. Before anyone could say more, the house screeched. It wasn't a sound of structural damage. It was the sound of a living thing screaming in pain. The candles in the library flickered and died, replaced by a cold, sickly gray light bleeding in from the walls. They're here, Alara said, her wings snapping wide. The room instantly filled with an ethereal, blinding brilliance. Back to back, Lucas, get behind me. Not a chance. Lucas grabbed a heavy iron fire poker, the only weapon he felt truly comfortable with. I'm not the one who needs guarding tonight. A shadow, darker than any night, spilled out of the floorboards. It took the shape of a jagged, humanoid claw, then pulled itself upward, coalescing into a hooded entity that seemed to absorb the light around it. It didn't have a face, only a swirling vortex of starlight and void. Clank the butler didn't hesitate. The armored suit lunged, its gauntlets glowing with defensive wards, slamming into the entity. They skidded across the library floor, sending books flying. Too many of them, Lyra shouted, her bowstring thrumming as she released 3 arrows of pure silver light. They pierced the creature, making it dissipate, but 2 more shadows clawed their way out of the walls. They're bypassing the doors, Seraphine hissed. She moved like a blur, her hands wreathed in dark, chaotic flames. She tore through the shadows, her tail acting as a whip that sliced through the void matter. Lucas found himself in the thick of it. A shadow wraith lunged for him, its touch feeling like ice on his skin. He didn't think. He just swung the iron poker with all his might. It connected with a solid, satisfying thwack that seemed to disrupt the creature's form. Iron, Lucas realized, shouting over the din. Cold iron hurts them. He's right, Broma cheered, swinging her axe in a wide, lethal arc. Everything's better with cold iron. Alara was a whirlwind of light. She didn't use a weapon. She simply touched the shadows, and where her skin met the void, it evaporated into mist. She was a beacon, guiding them, pulling the darkness away from the corners of the room. But there were too many. The walls were weeping shadow. The manor is failing, Alara cried. It can't hold the seal. Lucas looked at the table at the map of their home. He saw the portal's connection point. He ran to the library's fireplace, ignoring the clawing shadows. Alara, if I feed the fireplace with the iron salts from the kitchen, can you push the fire through the house's veins? Alara looked at him, her eyes searching his for a split second before her expression hardened into determination. If you do that, the house will burn, but it won't be destroyed. It will purge. Do it. Lucas grabbed a bag of iron-rich alchemical salts, something he'd been using to season his special Guardian-grade stew, and dumped the entire contents into the hearth. Alara didn't hesitate. She swooped down, her wings enveloping Lucas for a brief, warm moment before she slammed her palms against the hearth. A wave of golden, cleansing flame roared out from the fireplace, not burning the books but racing up the walls, through the ceiling, and into the very mortar of the house. The house gave a deep, triumphant roar. The shadows didn't just fade. They were ripped from reality, dragged back into the void by the house's own cleansing light. Then silence. The library returned to its state of dusty, calm elegance. The floating candelabras flickered back to life, though they looked a bit scorched. Lucas fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands were shaking, and his apron was ruined. Seraphine was at his side in an instant, her hands cupping his face, checking for injuries. Lyra and Broma were panting, their weapons lowered, while Clank stood in the corner, calmly straightening his moth-eaten bow tie as if he hadn't just wrestled a demon. Elara landed softly on the floor, her wings fatting back into the faint, glowing luminescence of her robe. She walked over, kneeling beside Lucas. "That," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "was an incredibly stupid and brilliant idea." Lucas looked up, his grin wobbly but genuine. "I told you I was good at cooking." Elara laughed, and the sound was so sweet that even the house seemed to sigh in relief. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "You saved us, Lucas. You saved the manor." "We saved it," he whispered, looking at all of them. Broma clapped him on the shoulder, nearly knocking him over again. "I'm starving. Is there any of that venison left, or did the shadow monsters eat it all?" "I think the kitchen is still intact," Lucas said, pulling himself up with Elara's help. "The kitchen is perfectly fine," Clank added, his gears clicking. "Though I suggest we keep the iron salts closer to the fireplace from now on." Lucas looked at his family, his wild, dangerous, magical, perfect family. The shadows were gone, and the stars outside the window were bright, steady, and peaceful. "Boar for everyone," Lucas said, walking toward the kitchen. "And maybe a little extra wine. I think we've earned it." The manor was quiet, not the anxious, humming quiet that preceded an attack, but the heavy, satisfied silence of a home that had finally been fed. The iron salts hadn't just purged the shadows, they had fused with the house's core, turning the manor into a permanent fortress of stability. But it had cost them. The basement portal, once a rippling, shimmering tier, had solidified into a heavy, reinforced archway made of iron and starlight. "It's closed," Lyra observed, running a finger along the cool stone of the arch. "Well, not closed but bound. It's no longer leaking, but it's also no longer a doorway." Elara stood beside her, her wings translucent and flickering like a dying fire. She looked tired, a kind of celestial exhaustion that made her movement slow. "I've spent an eternity being an anchor, Lyra. I think I've finally passed the burden to the house itself. It's not just a birdcage anymore. It's a shield." Lucas walked up behind them, carrying a tray with 4 mugs of hot, spiced cider. "And what does that make us? Are we still the guardians if there's nothing to guard?" "We are the residents," Elara said, taking a mug and smiling. "And residents have the hardest job of all. They have to decide what to do with the rest of their lives." They moved to the balcony, the night air cool against their faces. Below, the ocean roared, a constant, grounding sound. Broma was slumped in a chair, snoring softly, while Seraphine sat on the railing looking out at the stars. "I've been thinking," Seraphine said, her voice unusually soft. "About Northreach, about us. We spent so much time running from the forest, from our pasts, from our responsibilities. Now we're stuck here in a house that won't let us leave even if we wanted to." "Do you want to?" Lucas asked, his heart sinking slightly. Seraphine looked at him, her eyes reflecting the moon. She shook her head, a playful smirk touching her lips. "I'd missed the cooking too much, and I've grown quite fond of the way Elara tries to bribe the house into being tidy." "It's not bribery," Elara protested, though her wings twitched with amusement. "It's diplomacy." Lucas looked at his friends, at the elf who had found a reason to be curious again, the dwarf who had found a home for her fire, the Demonkin who had found something worth staying for, and the angel who had traded divinity for a kitchen. "You know," Lucas said, reaching out to clasp Seraphine's hand, "I realized something while we were fighting those wraiths. I wasn't fighting for the house. I wasn't fighting for the portal. I was fighting because, for the first time, I had something to lose." "And?" Alara asked, stepping closer. "And I think I'd like to keep it that way," Lucas finished. The house seemed to agree. A soft, golden light pulsed from the walls, warming the balcony. A nearby table, acting on its own accord, drifted over and offered them a plate of leftover pastries. "Well," Broma mumbled, waking up and immediately reaching for a pastry. "If we're staying, we need to talk about the guest rooms. I'm thinking we should convert the East Tower into an armory and a pub." "An armory and a pub," Lyra laughed, the sound bright and clear. "That sounds like a terrible idea." "It's a fantastic idea," Alara countered, her eyes sparkling. "I'll handle the beer brewing enchantments." Lucas laughed, the sound echoing out over the cliffside. The future didn't look like a long, lonely road anymore. It looked like a series of Tuesday afternoons, strange house guests, and a family that would always be there to help him face the shadows. 6 months later, Northreach had grown used to the manner of the cliff. It was no longer a place of mystery or fear, but a place of legend. On clear days, people claimed they could see the manor's towers glowing with a soft, shifting light, and the local market was always well-stocked with whatever strange, glowing herbs Lucas needed for his stews. It was a quiet morning, the kind that reminded Lucas of the first day he had met the three of them in the woods of Alarwin. The sun was rising, painting the ocean in shades of gold and violet. Lucas stood in the kitchen, carefully plating a breakfast that was, thankfully, firmly grounded on the table. The manor hummed with a contented, low-frequency vibration. Alara walked in, her wings now fully vibrant, glowing with the warm, steady light of a summer sun. She didn't hover anymore. She walked, her feet hitting the floorboards with a grounded, human rhythm. She smelled like lilies and fresh rain. "Clank is trying to organize the pantry by nutritional soul content again," she said, leaning against the counter and stealing a piece of bacon. "Tell him if he touches the spice rack, I'm turning him into a watering can," Lucas teased, handing her a plate. Seraphine and Broma tumbled into the room, mid-argument about whether a dragon would make a good pet or a terrible landlord. Lyra followed behind them, looking uncharacteristically relaxed, a book tucked under her arm. "The tide is perfect for a swim," Seraphine announced, grabbing a mug. And the giant crab sent a message. "Apparently, the birds are hosting a concert today." "I'm in," Broma said, grabbing her axe mostly to use as a walking stick. Alara looked at Lucas, her golden eyes filled with a peace that surpassed understanding. She walked over, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek, then took his hand. "We're going to the beach," she said. "The house will take care of itself." Lucas looked around his home. It was filled with laughter, the smell of good food, and the people he loved more than life itself. He thought back to the man who had walked in circles in the woods, terrified of being lost. He smiled, realizing that getting lost had been the only way to find his way to them. "I'm coming," Lucas said, untying his apron, "but someone else is carrying the lunch basket." "I'll carry it," Alara offered, her wings unfurling and catching the morning light, casting rainbows across the kitchen floor. They walked out together, a human, a Demonkin, an elf, a dwarf, and an angel down the winding stone path toward the sea. The manor stood tall behind them, its towers singing a soft, protective song in the wind. They didn't have a map, they didn't have a destination, they didn't have a mission. They had something much better. They had each other, the endless horizon, and the knowledge that, no matter where the tide of the multiverse took them, they were exactly where they belonged. "You know," Seraphine whispered as they reached the sand, the waves lapping at their feet, "you really are a terrible musician, Lucas." Lucas laughed, reaching out to pull her into a hug, then tugging Alara and Lyra and Broma into the fray. "And you're all hopeless at finding the way." "True," Alara admitted, looking up at the sky, her wings catching the breeze. "But we're a lot better at it when we're all together." And as they walked along the shore, the manor's towers glinting in the morning sun, the story didn't end. It just kept going, one ridiculous, wonderful, magical day at a time. The storm outside Northreach was a monster, a howling gale that rattled the stained glass windows of the cliffside manor and lashed at the sea walls with icy fingers. But inside, the house was a vessel of amber light, vibrating with a warmth that felt like a heartbeat. It had been a year since the Voidstalkers were purged, and life had settled into a rhythm that felt less like an adventure and more like a symphony. In the library, Lyra sat in an armchair, not reading but watching the others. Broma was sprawled on the oversized rug, her head resting on a pile of cushions, busy carving a piece of driftwood into a toy for the local village children. Seraphine was perched on the back of the sofa, her tail tracing lazy patterns against the fabric, while Alara sat cross-legged in the center of the room, her wings once so brilliant and sharp now relaxed and softly glowing, casting a hearth-like comfort over them all. And there was Lucas, standing by the fire just watching them. "You're doing it again," Alara said softly, her voice like warm honey. She didn't look up from her embroidery, but her wings gave a contented flutter. "You're counting us." "Force of habit," Lucas admitted, walking over. "When I was alone, I used to count the miles. Now I just like to make sure you're all still here." Seraphine hopped off the sofa and padded over, wrapping her arms around his waist. "We aren't going anywhere, Wanderer. We've grown roots." Broma tossed her carving aside and stood up, stretching until her spine popped with a sound like a small drum roll. "Roots are good, but roots need nourishment." She looked at Lucas with a grin. "And you promised us a feast for the solstice." Lucas laughed, leaning down to kiss Seraphine, then brushing his lips against Alara's forehead. He walked over to Lyra, who looked up with that faint, ethereal smile that only he ever seemed to fully draw out, and he leaned in to press his forehead against hers. The bond they shared wasn't loud or demanding. It was 5 different souls: a human who found his purpose, a demon who found her home, an elf who found her passion, a dwarf who found her kin, and an angel who found her humanity, all braided together like the roots of the ancient trees in Alarwin. They moved to the dining hall, a massive room that the house had refitted with a single, circular table. It was their sanctuary. As they sat, the house seemed to dim its lights, letting the firelight dominate. Lucas served the meal, a stew that hummed with the faint, magical spice of the crab dimension, paired with bread baked with Northreach sea salt. "To the road," Lyra said, raising her mug, her voice low and resonant. "The road that led us to each other." "To the Goose," Broma added, winking at Alara. Alara laughed, her wings shivering in delight. "To the Goose, indeed." "To the manor," Seraphine murmured, looking around at the walls that had become their protector. They looked at Lucas, their faces glowing in the firelight. It wasn't just admiration, it was a profound, grounding love. "To us," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "No more maps, no more wandering, just us." The night went on, filled with the kind of comfortable, easy laughter that can only exist between people who know every secret, every scar, and every dream of the others. There was no need for words, not when they sat so close that their shoulders touched, their hands intertwined, and their magic starlight, void fire, elven grace, and dwarven strength mingled in the air to create a scent of home. As the storm outside began to die down, Alara stood and walked to the center of the room. She reached out, and the manor groaned in response. The walls seemed to thin, the stone turning transparent for a heartbeat, showing the stars above and the sea below. "The manor is tired," Alara said, her voice echoing with divine authority. "It has protected us well. It is time we gave something back." She beckoned them over. They stood in a circle, hands joined. Lucas in the center, flanked by his 4 loves. "Close your eyes," she whispered. Lucas did. He felt Seraphine's heat, Broma's rough calluses, Lyra's cool, steady pulse, and Alara's vibrant, humming energy. He felt the house beneath their feet, the cliffside beneath the house, and the sea beneath the cliff. He didn't just feel like a man anymore. He felt like the center of a universe. A surge of white gold light swept through them, not a blast, but a gentle tide of warmth. It poured from Alara, anchored by the others, and seeped into the floorboards. The manor didn't just stand, it breathed. It wasn't just their home, it was their living, beating heart. When Lucas opened his eyes, the light faded, leaving behind a stillness so profound it felt holy. "We have bound our lives to this place," Alara said, her eyes gleaming with ancient wisdom. "We aren't travelers anymore. We are the cliff, the tide, and the star." Lucas looked at his 4 partners, his life, his love, his everything. He didn't need to go anywhere ever again. He pulled them all into a single, tangled embrace. It was a mess of wings, tails, braids, and human arms, a chaotic, beautiful heap of 5 hearts beating as one. "So," Broma whispered into the silence, breaking the tension with her usual bluntness, "who's helping with the dishes?" Lucas laughed, the sound bright and free, echoing through a house that was no longer haunted by shadows, but filled with the light of 5 people who had finally, truly come home. "I am," Lucas said, kissing Seraphine's cheek, then Alara, then Lyra, and ruffling Broma's hair. "But I think we can let the house do the scrubbing tonight." The manor creaked in happy agreement, and as the fire settled into embers, the 5 of them stayed there, in the quiet, in the dark, and in the perfect, infinite warmth of being together. The story of the lost man was over. The story of the manor of the 5 hearts had only just begun.